They burned his home, they took his wife, and they expected him to bow. But they forgot one thing: when you take everything from a man, you leave behind something far more dangerous, nothing to lose. This is the story of a knight who stood alone against an empire, a man whose name would echo through centuries, William Wallace. The man who turned pain into power and defiance into destiny. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and join us on this journey of untold legends, because some heroes may die, but their stories, they never fade. The cold winds of the Scottish Highlands swept through valleys that whispered with ancient legends, and in one of those valleys, a child named William Wallace came into the world. His birth was not marked by banners or crowns, but by struggle. He was born into a land chained by oppression, where the English crown claimed dominion over every hill and hearth. From his first breath, Wallace inherited not wealth, but the pain of a conquered people. The world he opened his eyes to was already scarred by injustice. As a boy, he watched English soldiers ride through villages like predators among sheep. Their banners fluttered above burning cottages. Their laughter echoed over the cries of his people. Every child grew up knowing fear, fear of the English guards, fear of punishment, fear of speaking one's own tongue. Yet, in Wallace's young heart, that fear began to twist into something else, a silent, growing defiance. Even before he could lift a sword, he learned that freedom was not something given. It was something taken back. His father, a simple man but proud, taught him the value of honor and courage. Around campfires, the elders spoke of the old kings, the warriors who once defended Scotland's soil with their blood. Wallace listened not as a boy lost in fantasy, but as someone already writing his own destiny. His mind was sharp, and his eyes carried the calm of someone who was always thinking, always waiting for his moment. The English tax collectors were the face of tyranny in those days. They came with scrolls and swords, taking more than money. They took dignity. Wallace saw his people kneel not from faith, but from survival, and it ate away at him piece by piece. He helped his father hide grain, helped neighbors rebuild what was burned, and quietly memorized the faces of those who ruled with cruelty. Every injustice engraved itself into his memory like scars carved in stone. When his father was killed during an early rebellion against the English, something inside Wallace changed. The boy who once watched from the shadows began to understand what it meant to fight, even when hope was gone. He learned that death was not the worst fate living on your knees was. That pain became his teacher, and grief became his first weapon. It taught him what no sword ever could: the cost of freedom. Wallace grew up strong and tall, a man who spoke little but whose presence commanded attention. He trained in secret, hunting in forests, sparring with others, sharpening his body and mind. The land itself seemed to prepare him, the rivers, the hills, the winds, all whispering the same truth. One day he would be called to rise. His silence was not weakness, it was a storm gathering behind calm skies. He learned to read and speak Latin, something few Scots could do. Knowledge became his hidden blade. He studied the laws and decrees imposed by the English, not out of loyalty, but to understand the enemy better. His intellect matched his strength, and together they made him dangerous, a man not only of passion but of purpose. Every time Wallace traveled through villages, he saw the same hopeless faces: mothers without sons, fathers without land, children without futures. The people had forgotten what pride felt like. Yet when they looked at Wallace, there was something in his eyes that reignited that memory, the quiet spark of rebellion. They didn't know it yet, but in that young man a movement was already breathing. Scotland at that time was a land of silence, its songs buried, its warriors broken. But even silence has a limit. Every generation births one soul unwilling to bow, one spirit that refuses submission. William Wallace was that spirit, shaped by loss, fueled by injustice, and born not to serve, but to stand. In the shadows of English castles, and beneath the grey Scottish skies, a legend was forming, not of royalty or privilege, but of resistance. The boy who had grown up watching his homeland bleed was no longer just a witness, he was becoming its answer. The name Wallace would soon echo through the valleys, not as that of a victim, but as the beginning of rebellion itself. As the years passed, the grip of the English crown around Scotland tightened like a noose. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, ruled not only through armies but through fear. His word was law, his justice absolute, and his cruelty legendary. His soldiers roamed the villages freely, taking what they pleased, grain, livestock, even lives. To the Scots he was not a king but a conqueror wearing a crown of blood. Every new decree he issued stripped them further of their rights, their pride, and their hope. Wallace watched it all unfold, his anger buried deep beneath a calm exterior, waiting for the right moment to surface. The English lords treated Scotland as a prize, not a nation. They divided lands among themselves, forcing Scottish peasants to work for their wealth. The proud clans who once stood tall now lived under foreign banners. Markets were taxed, families were displaced, and even the churches, once sacred ground, were under English control. The weight of oppression was heavy, but for Wallace it was not enough to break him, it was shaping him. Every act of injustice added fuel to the fire that was already burning in his heart. The countryside was filled with spies and soldiers who enforced Edward's will. They demanded obedience, punishing anyone who dared to speak of rebellion. The Scottish nobles, many of whom once fought bravely, had grown fearful or corrupt. Some sought favor with the English to protect their wealth and titles, while others turned a blind eye to the suffering of their people. Wallace, though still young, saw clearly that the kingdom was rotting from both outside and within. The enemy was not just the English army, it was cowardice itself. In villages, whispers began to spread about a new order, one that would erase Scotland's name from history. The English crown aimed to turn the Scots into loyal subjects, to crush their language, their traditions, and their faith. Soldiers enforced curfews, and punishments for disobedience were brutal. Men were hanged in the town square for defying orders. Women were mistreated, homes burned, and resistance met with death. The land that once sang with freedom now echoed with the sound of chains. Wallace traveled through the countryside, often disguised, helping those he could. He would deliver food to the hungry, protect the weak from soldiers, and spread quiet words of defiance. He was not yet a leader in title, but in spirit he already carried the burden of one. The people began to notice the tall man with piercing eyes who never bowed to an English guard. They didn't know his name yet, but they felt his strength, and for the first time they began to remember what bravery looked like. Among his people there was a growing sense of despair that felt like an illness. Many had accepted that Scotland's freedom was gone forever. But Wallace refused to accept defeat. He believed that if one man dared to fight back, others would follow. In every broken man he saw a soldier waiting to awaken. In every widow he saw the cost of tyranny. His anger was not blind, it was focused, disciplined, and patient. He knew that when he struck, it would not be out of impulse, but out of necessity. King Edward's cruelty reached its peak when he began enforcing new laws that struck at the very soul of Scotland. Marriages were interfered with, families torn apart, and entire villages forced into servitude. Wallace saw these laws not just as political control, but as an attack on dignity itself. He could endure hunger and hardship, but not humiliation. He could forgive loss, but not the deliberate destruction of his people's spirit. His silence became heavier with each passing day, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. One night, Wallace stood on a hill overlooking his village, watching the fires of English camps burn across the valley. The sky was red with the smoke of suffering, and in that crimson glow he made a vow to himself. He would no longer stand by. He would no longer watch others decide the fate of his land. His life, from that moment forward, would belong not to peace, but to resistance. If freedom required sacrifice, he would give it. If vengeance required blood, he would spill it. He began to gather small groups of men, those who had lost everything, those with nothing left to fear. Farmers, shepherds, and wanderers joined him quietly, drawn by his resolve. In the shadows of oppression, a new force was forming, one born not from politics or crowns, but from pain and faith. Wallace had no armor of gold or an army behind him, but he had something far more dangerous: conviction. The chains of tyranny may have bound Scotland's body, but they could not touch its soul, and in that soul, William Wallace became the heartbeat of defiance. The English crown had taken his people's land, their pride, and their peace, but it had unknowingly created the one man who would bring fire back to Scotland. The knight who would rise not for power, but for freedom. The moment that changed everything came without warning. The English soldiers, as cruel as ever, had imposed their control over every part of Scottish life, even love. William Wallace, who had found a rare peace in the arms of his beloved wife Murren, tried to live quietly, away from bloodshed. Their love was his sanctuary, a small flame in a dark and merciless world. But that peace was fragile, and when an English officer attempted to dishonor her, Wallace's restraint snapped. In a single moment of defiance, he struck back, killing the man who had violated their dignity. It was an act of justice, but in the eyes of the English, it was treason. The retaliation was swift and merciless. Soldiers came to the village in the dead of night, torchlight flickering against the thatched roofs, bringing fire and death with them. Wallace was away when they came for Murren, dragging her into the square as an example. Before the eyes of her people, they executed her without mercy. The village stood frozen in horror as her life was taken, a warning from the English to all who dared to resist. By the time Wallace returned, the air still smelled of smoke and blood. The love of his life was gone, and with her, the last piece of his peace. He knelt beside her lifeless body, his hands trembling not with fear but with fury. The world around him faded, replaced only by the burning weight of loss. His grief was not silent. It was a scream inside his soul. Every memory of her, her smile, her laughter, the warmth of her hand, now became a wound that would never heal. What the English had done was not just murder. It was a declaration of war, and Wallace, heartbroken but unbroken, accepted that declaration. The next day, the same village that had watched helplessly would witness something extraordinary. Wallace returned not as the quiet man they had known, but as something reborn, a warrior forged by loss. With a few loyal men, he ambushed the English garrison stationed nearby. The soldiers, arrogant and unprepared, were caught completely off guard. Wallace's rage was unstoppable. The man who had once sought peace now unleashed fury upon those who had taken it from him. When the smoke cleared, the English soldiers lay dead, their banners torn and their arrogance burned away. It wasn't just vengeance, it was the beginning of rebellion. The villagers, who had bowed their heads for years, now looked upon Wallace with awe and fear. He had done what no one else dared to do: strike back. The story of that night spread like wildfire through the Highlands, whispered from village to village until his name became a symbol. But even as blood cooled on his blade, Wallace did not find satisfaction. Vengeance had not brought him peace, it had given him purpose. He knew that killing a few soldiers would not change anything. The real war had just begun. Murren's death became his reason to fight, not just for himself, but for every man, woman, and child who had lost someone to the English crown. Her memory became his banner, her spirit his shield. He began to gather others who had suffered the same way, men whose wives had been taken, whose sons had been slain, whose homes had been burned. They were broken in body but alive in spirit, and Wallace gave them something greater than revenge, a cause. Under his leadership, their anger became unity, their sorrow became strength. What began as grief began to transform into a movement. The English called him a murderer, but to his people he was becoming a hero. He trained them not only in battle but in belief. He taught them to strike from the shadows, to use the land to their advantage, to fight not with fear but with fury. His army wasn't built on gold or promises. It was built on pain, courage, and faith. For the first time in years, the Scots began to believe that freedom wasn't a dream, it was possible. Each night Wallace would sit alone, staring into the fire, his mind replaying the moment he lost Murren. Her death haunted him, but it also guided him. He could still hear her voice in the wind, soft but unyielding, reminding him why he fought. The fire reflected in his eyes was no longer just anger. It was destiny. He had become something the English could not understand, a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. And so, from the ashes of one woman's unjust death, a revolution was born. The man who once sought only peace now carried the weight of a nation's vengeance. His sword was no longer his alone. It was the voice of the silenced, the vengeance of the oppressed, and the promise of freedom. The spark had been lit, and the flames would soon engulf the empire that believed itself untouchable. Word of Wallace's vengeance spread through Scotland faster than wildfire, racing across dry grass. His name was whispered in taverns, murmured in market squares, and prayed in hushed tones inside churches. The English saw him as a criminal, but to the Scots he had become something else entirely, a symbol of what they had all lost, and what they still might regain. Men who had long since given up hope began to find courage again. Farmers laid down their plows, blacksmiths set aside their hammers, and shepherds traded their staffs for swords. One by one they came to him, not out of obligation, but out of belief. Wallace did not recruit soldiers, he inspired them. At first they were only a few dozen, rough men with no armor, no discipline, and no reason to trust anyone. Yet when they looked into Wallace's eyes, they saw conviction that could not be faked. He spoke to them not as a lord, but as a brother. He told them that they were not fighting for him, but for their own freedom, for their wives, for their children, for the right to stand as men and not subjects. Those words hit deeper than any order or sermon could. His leadership was not born of authority, but of truth. He trained them in the forests, teaching them to move like shadows and strike with precision. The English armies were larger and better armed, but Wallace turned that into their weakness. He showed his men that victory wasn't about power, it was about understanding your enemy and never underestimating your own will. He turned hunters into warriors and peasants into soldiers. For every sword they lacked, they made up for it in fury. They learned to use terrain, to strike at night, to disappear before reinforcements could come. Slowly, their confidence grew, and with it, the rebellion spread. The English began to hear rumors of a ghost army, men who appeared out of nowhere, burned supply lines, ambushed patrols, and vanished back into the mist. The legend of Wallace was growing beyond the man himself. He became both myth and message. Every English soldier feared the whisper of his name. Every Scottish farmer carried it in his heart like a prayer. His defiance was infectious, spreading to clans that had once been divided by pride and rivalry. For the first time in decades, Scotland began to move as one. Wallace's leadership went beyond the sword. He understood the hearts of his people. When they were weary, he reminded them what they were fighting for. When they doubted, he reminded them of what they had already overcome. His presence was enough to reignite courage even in men who thought they had none left. He didn't promise victory, he promised meaning. It is better to die free than live as slaves, he told them, and those words became the heartbeat of his rebellion. His victories began small, ambushes on convoys, surprise raids on English outposts, swift strikes that crippled supply lines. Each success drew more followers. With every skirmish, his army grew stronger and more united. They began to believe that perhaps God had not abandoned them after all. Wallace had become a symbol of divine justice to many, a man chosen by fate to restore balance in a world of cruelty. The English crown, once untouchable, was now being challenged by a man they had dismissed as a commoner. Soon, Wallace's band of rebels transformed into a formidable force. What began as a handful of angry men became an army of believers. They no longer feared death, they feared only submission. Under Wallace's command, they reclaimed towns, freed prisoners, and drove English garrisons out of Scottish lands. Villages that once flew the English banner now raised the saltire, the white cross of Scotland. Each victory strengthened their spirit and deepened their loyalty to Wallace, not as a king, but as the voice of freedom. Wallace himself never wore a crown, never claimed royal blood. Yet he commanded more respect than any noble. He shared their hunger, fought beside them, and never placed himself above them. His leadership was born not from title, but from shared suffering. In his eyes, every man was equal, every soul deserving of freedom. The nobles watched with unease as the people rallied behind a man they saw as an outsider, a rebel. But the people saw in him something they had not seen in their lord's honor. The English could not comprehend how a leader like Wallace had emerged from nowhere. To them, power came from birthright and titles. To the Scots, Wallace proved that true power came from conviction. The harder the English tried to crush the rebellion, the stronger it grew. Each attempt to silence him only amplified his legend. Wallace had become the voice of a nation too long silenced, a voice that would not yield. And so the farmer's son, the husband-turned-warrior, became the leader of an army. He had no throne, no castle, no wealth, only the unwavering belief that freedom was worth dying for. The rebellion he started out of grief had become a movement bound by unity. He did not fight for glory or revenge alone, he fought for something larger than himself. The English saw him as an enemy. The Scots began to see him as destiny. The English crown could no longer ignore the wildfire spreading across Scotland. Wallace's victories were not mere rebellions anymore. They were open challenges to royal authority. When word reached King Edward, known as Longshanks, fury consumed him. He had believed Scotland subdued, its people too broken to resist. Yet now, villages once loyal to England were burning English banners, and soldiers sent to enforce order were returning in pieces. Edward dispatched his most seasoned commanders with one goal: to crush Wallace and make his rebellion an example so terrifying that no Scotsman would dare defy him again. But Wallace was not the kind of enemy they were trained to fight. His strategies defied every military convention. He avoided open battle where English heavy cavalry could dominate and instead drew them into marshes, forests, and narrow passes, places where their discipline became a burden and his men's agility became an advantage. He used deception as his sharpest weapon, spreading false rumors, leading small groups to strike and retreat, and always staying one step ahead. To the English, it felt like fighting shadows that refused to stand still. Then came Stirling Bridge, the moment when the rebellion became legend. The English, confident in their superior numbers and armor, marched across the narrow wooden bridge spanning the river Forth. Wallace, watching from the hills, waited until half of their force had crossed before giving the signal. His men struck with fury and precision, destroying the bridge and trapping hundreds of English soldiers in chaos. The river turned red as panicked men were cut down or drowned under the weight of their own armor. Against all odds, Wallace's outnumbered army had annihilated a much stronger English force. News of the victory thundered across the land. Scotland roared with pride. For the first time in generations, the people believed that the impossible was within reach. Wallace's name became a rallying cry, a beacon of hope that cut through centuries of fear. He was hailed not as a mere warrior, but as a liberator. Bards began to sing of his triumph, and his legend reached even the ears of those who had once doubted him. The nobles who had mocked him were forced to bow to his strength. Wallace did not let the victory intoxicate him. He knew it was only the beginning. The English crown would never forgive such humiliation, and retaliation was inevitable. He prepared his men, teaching them discipline without losing their spirit. He organized them into ranks, appointed captains, and built alliances with local clans. His leadership evolved from raw passion to tactical mastery. He understood that the fight ahead was not just of swords, but of endurance, a battle to outlast an empire. While the people celebrated, Wallace carried the weight of leadership in silence. He knew that each victory came at a cost, the lives of men who followed him out of faith. At night, he walked among the tents, speaking to his soldiers, sharing their fires and their fears. He reminded them of their cause, that they were fighting not for conquest, but for the right to live without chains. His humility kept them grounded, his courage kept them burning. The English, humiliated but not defeated, began plotting revenge. They sent spies to infiltrate his ranks, to spread lies and divide his followers. Wallace understood that the greatest threat to any rebellion was not the enemy outside, but the betrayal within. He moved carefully, trusting few, yet never losing his compassion. He knew fear could corrupt even the bravest hearts, and so he led by example, showing no weakness, no hesitation. His resolve became the armor of his people. The Scottish nobles, jealous of his growing influence, began to whisper among themselves. They feared that a man born without title was now commanding more loyalty than all of them combined. Some saw him as a hero, others as a danger to their own power. Wallace was too focused on the greater war to notice the shadows forming behind him. He believed that unity was the only path to victory, but unity among the ambitious is fragile. Despite the gathering threats, Wallace pressed onward. His army grew stronger, his reputation broader. He marched south into England, striking towns and fortresses, showing the invaders that Scotland would not kneel quietly. The English countryside trembled with stories of the Scottish ghost, the man who fought like a storm and vanished before dawn. Each battle he won carved his name deeper into history. Each victory another wound in England's pride. But in the midst of triumph, Wallace remained haunted by the past. Every success, every cheer from his people, echoed against the memory of his wife's death, the spark that had ignited it all. Her face reminded him why he fought, why he could not stop, and why surrender was never an option. To avenge her was no longer his sole mission. It had become the heart of a nation's fight for freedom. The English had created their greatest enemy not by conquest, but by cruelty, and Wallace was their consequence. The English crown could not bear the humiliation of defeat, and Edward Longshanks himself took command to restore his empire's pride. He was ruthless, cunning, and determined to erase Wallace's name from history. Armies began marching north again, larger and more disciplined than before, carrying not just swords but vengeance. Wallace, knowing what was coming, refused to cower. He understood that the war had entered a new phase, one not fought merely with strength, but with endurance and strategy. He urged his men to prepare for the storm that was approaching. The enemy was no longer underestimating them, and that made the challenge far greater. As the English advanced, they burned everything in their path. Villages were razed, fields destroyed, and families slaughtered to starve Wallace's army. The brutality was beyond anything the Scots had seen before. Edward wanted to crush not just the rebellion, but the very spirit of the Scottish people. Wallace's followers began to lose faith. Many had fought for hope and freedom, but now they faced despair and hunger. The weight of leadership pressed heavier on Wallace's shoulders than ever before. He could see the doubt in their eyes, but he refused to let it take root. He gathered his men beneath the cold, gray sky, and spoke to them with the fire of conviction that had once sparked their courage. He reminded them that England fought for power, but Scotland fought for survival. They fight for a king. He said, but we fight for our land, for our families, for the right to call ourselves free. His words reignited a flicker of hope. Men who were ready to flee chose to stand and fight again. It was not the promise of victory that kept them there, but the promise that they would not die as slaves. The next great confrontation came at Falkirk. The English army was massive, knights, archers, and infantry moving like a wall of steel. Wallace's men were outnumbered, but they had faith in their leader's strategy. He formed his troops into tight formations called schiltrons, circles of spearmen that could hold against cavalry. As the English charged, the ground shook beneath them, and the clash of steel echoed across the battlefield. For hours the Scots held firm, their spears piercing through waves of armored knights. It was a test of willpower as much as skill. But then betrayal struck. The Scottish nobles, jealous and fearful of Wallace's growing influence, withdrew their cavalry mid-battle, abandoning him to face the English alone. The lines began to break. The English archers rained death from afar, and the schiltrons fell one by one. Wallace fought until the field was soaked in blood, his face streaked with dirt and grief. When retreat became the only option, he refused to call it defeat. He led the survivors away, his spirit unbroken even as his army lay shattered behind him. The loss at Falkirk was devastating. Many believed it was the end of the rebellion, but Wallace saw it differently. To him, the defeat was not in losing the battle, but in surrendering the cause. He retreated into the Highlands, regrouping with the few loyal men who remained. The nobles made peace with Edward, seeking safety under the English crown, but Wallace would not bend. He became an outlaw again, hunted, cornered, but never conquered. His rebellion had lost its army, yet his name still commanded fear among the oppressors and reverence among the oppressed. Living in the shadows, Wallace continued to strike wherever he could. He no longer led vast armies, but his raids were precise and devastating. Every small victory was a reminder that the fire of freedom still burned. He became a ghost once more, a legend whispered across both kingdoms. English soldiers claimed to see him in their nightmares. Scots prayed for him in secret. Though isolated, he refused to give up. Wallace knew that symbols could outlive armies, and he intended to remain one until his last breath. Even in exile, he worked tirelessly to rebuild alliances. He reached out to foreign powers, seeking aid for Scotland's cause. His loyalty never wavered, even as the world around him turned cold. Many of his own people began to doubt that freedom was worth the price, yet Wallace carried the burden alone. The loneliness of leadership, the sting of betrayal, and the endless struggle only hardened his resolve. He had lost battles, friends, and his place among men, but not his soul. The English tried to paint him as a criminal, a savage who defied the rightful rule of a king. But among the common people he remained something greater, a living embodiment of resistance. His name was no longer just a name, it was an idea. Mothers told their sons stories of his bravery. Fathers raised their swords in his honor. Wallace's rebellion had evolved beyond one man. It had become Scotland's heart. Years of struggle had taken everything from him, wealth, comfort, and peace, but they had given him immortality. Even as he wandered the wild lands, hunted and betrayed, his defiance lived on. The English could conquer lands, but not the will of a man who refused to kneel. Wallace had become more than a leader, he had become the living memory of freedom itself, a reminder that even when empires rise, one man's courage can shake their foundations. Wallace's refusal to submit made him the most wanted man in all of Britain. The English crown placed a bounty so great upon his head that even those who once called him brother began to whisper of surrender. He became a fugitive in his own homeland, moving through forests, mountains, and secret paths only few dared to tread. His beard had grown wild, his armor worn thin, but his spirit, unyielding as the Scottish hills, remained untouched. Wherever he went, he carried the silent burden of his fallen comrades, and though his army was gone, the rebellion still lived in his heart. The people still offered him shelter, food, and loyalty, even knowing it could cost them their lives. In the shadows, Wallace became both legend and ghost. The English feared him not because of the armies he once led, but because they could not kill his defiance. He appeared where they least expected, destroying convoys, ambushing patrols, and striking down tax collectors who preyed on the poor. His presence inspired new uprisings. Small groups of Scots began fighting again in his name, each strike a spark to reignite the fire he had started years before. Edward's soldiers began to wonder if Wallace was mortal at all, or some vengeful spirit sent to haunt them. But even a legend can bleed. As time passed, the network around Wallace began to crumble. Spies infiltrated the Scottish resistance, spreading lies, tracking his movements, and turning old allies against him. He had trusted too deeply in the loyalty of men who feared more than they believed. One by one, his hiding places became known. Yet, each time the English thought they had cornered him, he slipped away, leaving only their dead behind. His survival was more than luck, it was willpower sharpened by loss. Despite his isolation, Wallace never abandoned his mission. He traveled in disguise, sometimes as a monk, sometimes as a merchant, always keeping the flame of rebellion alive. He carried messages to those still loyal, urging them to remain united, to remember what they fought for. Even as Edward's armies occupied more of Scotland, Wallace refused to let despair take root. They can take our lives. He told a group of loyal farmers once, but they'll never take the right to hope. Those words echoed across villages like prophecy. The English crown, frustrated by his endurance, began offering fortunes for information about his whereabouts. They spread promises of wealth and pardon to anyone who could deliver Wallace alive. Greed began to outweigh loyalty. Among his dwindling allies, some began to falter, torn between survival and honor. One of them was Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish noble once trusted by Wallace himself. Menteith saw an opportunity, not for peace, but for power, and made a secret pact with the English to betray his own countrymen. The betrayal came quietly, without glory or battle. On a cold night, Wallace took refuge near Glasgow, trusting Menteith's word that he would find safety there. Instead, he found chains. English soldiers, guided by the traitor, surrounded him while he slept. Wallace fought even then, taking down several before being overwhelmed. His last moments of freedom were marked not by fear, but by the same fire that had carried him through years of war. Bound and bloodied, he stared at his captors without shame, refusing to bow his head. When news of his capture spread, Scotland mourned as though the land itself had been wounded. The people wept, but their grief carried fury. Wallace was taken in chains to London, paraded through jeering crowds as the English mocked him. Yet even in defeat, he did not look like a prisoner. The chains were heavy, but his gaze was steady. He walked not like a defeated man, but like a king who knew his throne was eternal, not of gold, but of memory. The people who saw him that day would never forget his defiance. The English court demanded he confess to treason. Wallace, standing tall despite the torture, replied that he could never be a traitor, for he had never sworn loyalty to England. His words silenced the room, his truth too sharp to be denied. To them, he was a criminal. To his people, he was the last free man of Scotland. His trial was a formality. The verdict had already been written. Yet, even facing death, he refused to yield an inch of his pride. In the final days before his execution, Wallace was starved, tortured, and humiliated, but no pain could break his will. Every lash only hardened the symbol he had become. The English sought to destroy his body, but instead they immortalized his name. Wallace's courage in the face of such cruelty became a story told across centuries, a man who could not be broken by fear or flame. His silence in suffering spoke louder than any speech. And so, the hero who had defied a king, united a nation, and stood against an empire, ended his mortal journey in chains. But his legacy transcended death. The English thought they were silencing rebellion. Instead, they were birthing legend. His death did not extinguish Scotland's fire. It fanned it into eternity. For even in betrayal, Wallace's story became proof that freedom, once awakened, can never truly be killed. The morning of Wallace's execution was grey and cold, a silence heavy over the streets of London. Crowds gathered not merely to witness a punishment, but to see the man who had defied kings, armies, and empires. The English saw him as a savage, but even among them, there was an uneasy respect. Bound in chains, battered and weakened, Wallace was dragged through the streets on a wooden cart, his body bruised but his eyes unwavering. Every bump of the road, every jeer from the crowd was meant to humiliate him, but he held his head high. His very posture was defiance. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. As he was paraded through the city, something strange happened. Among the mockery and cruelty, whispers began to spread, admiration even from the enemy. Mothers shielded their children's eyes from the brutality, yet many secretly prayed for the soul of the man before them. Soldiers assigned to guard him looked away, ashamed. They had fought wars, but none had ever faced a man who bore his death with such dignity. In that moment, Wallace became something more than a rebel. He became the embodiment of courage against tyranny. When he was finally brought before the execution platform, the judge read out his crimes: treason, murder, and rebellion. Wallace listened in silence until the word treason was spoken. Then, summoning what strength he had left, he declared in a clear voice, "I could never be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." Those words hung in the air like thunder. Even his enemies could not deny the truth in them. It was a moment that stripped the illusion of authority from an empire, exposing the courage of a single man who stood by his principles until the end. The punishment that awaited him was designed to break not just his body but the will of his people. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal sentence reserved for those who challenged the crown. Yet, through every stage of his torment, he refused to cry out for mercy. Pain, they said, could make any man beg. But Wallace's silence spoke louder than any plea. His suffering was his message, and every drop of blood that fell that day became a word in the story of freedom Scotland would carry forever. As the executioners worked, Wallace's gaze remained steady, fixed not on them but on the heavens. He did not curse his fate. He embraced it as the price of his cause. To him, this was not an ending, but the proof that his life had meant something greater. His final breath was not of despair, but of victory, because though they could destroy his body, they could never touch his belief. And in that moment, the people watching, even those who had come to mock, felt a shift inside their hearts. When his lifeless body was dismembered, the English believed they had destroyed the symbol of rebellion. They placed his head on a spike above London Bridge, a warning to all who dared to dream of defiance. But instead of fear, it sowed something else. Merchants passing beneath whispered his name. Travelers carried his story back to Scotland. The more they tried to erase him, the more immortal he became. Legends are not silenced by violence, they are born from it. In Scotland, the news of his death spread like a storm. The people mourned not just a warrior, but a voice that had spoken for them when no one else would. Villages held secret vigils, clans raised their banners again, and songs of Wallace's courage echoed across the Highlands. He had been one man, yet his sacrifice had reignited the nation's resolve. Edward had hoped to kill rebellion that day, but instead he had given it a martyr. The Scottish people now fought not only for freedom, but for the memory of the man who had died for it. Years later, even the English chroniclers could not deny the impact of Wallace's death. His execution, intended as a lesson in obedience, became a lesson in courage. His name was spoken with awe by those who had seen him face death without fear. Scholars wrote of his bravery, poets sang of his spirit, and kings who came after trembled at the thought of such defiance. Wallace had changed what it meant to fight for freedom. He had proven that a man's legacy could outlive his flesh. The rebellion he began did not die with him. Robert the Bruce would later rise and lead Scotland to independence, carrying the same fire Wallace had lit. Every victory that followed traced its roots to the courage of one man who refused to kneel. Wallace had planted the seed of liberty so deep that even centuries of oppression could not bury it. He had shown that freedom is not granted, it is earned through sacrifice, through faith, and through the unbreakable will of those who dare to stand. And so in death William Wallace became eternal. His story transcended borders, generations, and empires. The man the English sought to destroy became a symbol of hope for all who suffered under tyranny. His courage lived on not in monuments or titles, but in the hearts of people who understood that freedom demands a price, and Wallace had paid it in full. His legacy whispered one truth through time: a man may die, but his cause, if righteous, never does. Years passed after Wallace's death, yet his spirit refused to fade. The English had won the battle for his body, but not for his legacy. Across the hills and valleys of Scotland, his story spread like sacred scripture. Children grew up hearing his name whispered around firesides, not as a tale of sorrow, but as a song of defiance. His courage became a compass for a people still chained under English rule. Farmers, soldiers, and even nobles began to see that Wallace's struggle had not been for himself, it had been for all of them. His blood had watered the roots of a freedom that would one day rise again. In the aftermath of his death, King Edward believed he had silenced Scotland forever. He could not have been more wrong. Instead of obedience, his cruelty awakened rage. The Scottish people began to unite once more, their divisions fading in the shadow of Wallace's sacrifice. He had shown them that no king, no empire could rule the human spirit. His death became a rallying cry. If one man could defy a kingdom, what could a nation do if it stood together? Even those who had once betrayed him now carried guilt, their shame turning into a quiet rebellion of its own. In villages and towns, secret gatherings began to form. Wallace's name was invoked as a blessing before battle, as if his spirit were still among them. The English soldiers occupying Scotland found themselves facing enemies not of flesh, but of memory. Every time they marched through a Scottish town, they could feel it, the invisible presence of the man they had killed. His image haunted them, his courage mocking their power. The Empire had executed a man, but in doing so, it had created a myth. Poets began to write of him, chroniclers to record his story, and ballads to immortalize his name. Even generations later, when the details of battles blurred into legend, the essence of Wallace remained clear. He had fought not for conquest, but for freedom. He had faced betrayal, suffering, and death without surrender. His name became synonymous with honor, the kind of honor that outlasts kingdoms. The English might have owned the land for a time, but they would never own the spirit of Scotland again. Robert the Bruce, who had once hesitated and even betrayed Wallace's cause, could not escape the shadow of his example. He realized that if Scotland were ever to be free, it would have to follow Wallace's path. Bruce took up the torch of rebellion that Wallace had lit and carried it forward with fierce determination. At Bannockburn, when the Scots stood against overwhelming English forces, it was not just Bruce's leadership that gave them strength, it was the echo of Wallace's defiance that roared in their hearts. The victory that day belonged as much to Wallace as it did to the army that fought under Bruce. Over the centuries, Wallace's name outgrew the borders of his homeland. He became not just a Scottish hero, but a symbol of universal resistance. His story reached other nations, inspiring revolutions and rebellions across the world. To every people living under oppression, Wallace's life was proof that one person's courage could light the fire of freedom for millions. His legacy became timeless, his struggle eternal. The cry freedom that once echoed through the Highlands became the voice of humanity itself. The English rulers who had sought to erase him eventually found themselves forced to acknowledge his greatness. Even their own historians began to write of his valor, unable to deny the mark he had left on history. Statues were raised in his honor centuries after his death, not just as a tribute to Scotland's son, but as a testament to the endurance of truth over tyranny. Empires rise and fall, but legends like Wallace never fade. His name continued to stand tall, carved into the soul of a nation that refused to bow. Time turned his story into a mirror through which people saw the essence of bravery. His defiance reminded humanity that power does not come from crowns, but from conviction. The lessons of his life crossed the boundaries of culture and faith, teaching that freedom is not a gift, it is a responsibility carried by the brave. Wallace had shown the world that even when surrounded by betrayal and death, a man's faith in his cause could make him immortal. In Scotland, every hill and glen still whispers his name. Monuments rise where he once fought, and his spirit lingers in the wind that sweeps across the land he died defending. Generations come and go, yet each new heart that beats with pride for Scotland carries a part of Wallace within it. He had become the soul of the nation, a silent guardian watching over his people, and though centuries have passed, the story of William Wallace remains a living flame. It reminds every listener that tyranny may command armies, but freedom commands hearts. His struggle was not only for his own time, but for all time, for every man and woman who refuses to kneel to injustice. His legacy stands as proof that courage can echo across eternity, and that even when the body falls, the spirit of freedom never dies. Centuries after William Wallace's death, his name still carried the thunder of rebellion. Time could not bury the echoes of his defiance. In the ruins of old castles and the songs of the people, his presence lingered like a sacred fire. He was not remembered as a martyr to be pitied, but as a warrior to be honored. His sacrifice had transcended history. It had become myth. Children who knew nothing of kings or politics still knew the name Wallace. To them, he was the man who stood against impossible odds and refused to kneel, no matter the cost. His story became more than memory. It became a heartbeat of Scottish identity. In every generation, when Scotland faced struggle or hardship, his legend returned like a guiding star. Farmers, soldiers, and dreamers looked to his tale for strength, believing that the same blood that ran in Wallace ran in them. He had shown that a single man could awaken the courage of a nation, that truth could defy tyranny, and that even death could not silence honor. The English might have conquered lands, but they never conquered the idea of freedom that Wallace had planted in every Scottish heart. His life became proof that even when the world crushes the body, it cannot touch the soul that fights for justice. Monuments began to rise in his name, tall stone towers that pierced the sky as if reaching for the heaven he had looked to on his final day. The most famous, the Wallace Monument near Stirling, stood on the very soil where he had led his people to victory. Visitors from every corner of the world came to stand where he once stood, to feel the same wind that had carried his voice across the battlefield. They came not just to remember him, but to draw strength from the spirit that refused to die. Each monument was not merely a memorial. It was a promise that his sacrifice had not been in vain. Even beyond Scotland, Wallace became a symbol of the eternal human struggle for freedom. Revolutions across Europe and the Americas drew inspiration from his defiance. Leaders fighting empires invoked his name. Poets wrote verses about his courage, and historians called him the Spirit of Liberty. He was no longer bound to one nation. He belonged to all who had ever resisted oppression. His sword might have rusted, but his story became sharper with every telling. Where chains existed, his memory was there to break them. For Scotland, Wallace's story became a moral compass. It reminded the people that freedom was not a birthright, but a prize earned by courage and sacrifice. His defiance had become the measure of their own. Whenever tyranny threatened, his image rose again, reminding rulers that the Scottish soul could not be subdued. Even kings who later ruled Scotland knew that their legitimacy rested on the same foundation Wallace had fought for, the will of a free people. His rebellion, though centuries old, still breathed through the laws, songs, and hearts of his nation. The world remembered Wallace not as a man who lost, but as a man who refused to surrender. History often favors the victors, yet Wallace's legacy proved that sometimes it is the defeated who define victory. His death became more powerful than his life, because it showed that true strength lies not in survival, but in standing for what is right, even unto death. The English may have executed his body, but they had unknowingly immortalized his name. It was not written in ink, but carved in courage, etched into the heart of history itself. Even as centuries brought peace and progress, his story continued to resonate. Modern Scotland looked to him as the father of its independence, the first to declare that no crown could own the will of a people. Statues of him stood not in mourning, but in triumph depictions of a man holding his sword aloft, as if daring the world to forget. They never did. Tourists who came to learn of Scotland's past found that Wallace's story still lived in every stone, every flag, every proud voice that spoke of freedom. His legend had become inseparable from the land he had died for. Artists, writers, and filmmakers reignited his tale for new generations. Each retelling, though shaped by time, carried the same burning message: courage defies empires. When people saw his story on screen or heard his name in song, they did not see just a warrior. They saw themselves, reflected in the eternal struggle between oppression and liberty. In every era, Wallace was reborn not as a ghost, but as a reminder that humanity's greatest weapon is an unbreakable spirit. His life continued to inspire those who faced their own battles, no matter how far from the highlands they lived. Through the centuries, his name came to stand for something greater than one nation's freedom. It stood for the freedom of all people. He became a symbol of universal defiance, the living embodiment of a truth that time cannot erase, that every human being, no matter how small or powerless, has the right to stand and say no to injustice. His sword had long since fallen silent, but his story continued to cut through the ages like a blade made of light. And so, William Wallace remained not a relic of the past, but a voice for the future. His story endures because it is not only about war, but about the eternal battle for dignity, faith, and freedom. Every generation that rises against tyranny carries a spark of his spirit. He was more than a man. He was an idea, and ideas cannot die. The English took his life, but they gave the world a legend that would never fade. Wallace's name still echoes through time, whispering to all who hear it that freedom, once awakened, can never again be chained. And so, the man they tried to erase became the voice of freedom itself. William Wallace's body was broken, but his spirit rose higher than any king's throne. His courage reminded the world that true power doesn't come from crowns, it comes from conviction. Centuries may pass, empires may crumble, but the flame he lit still burns in every soul that dares to stand for justice. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with us, because we're not done telling the stories of those who refused to kneel. Heroes like Wallace may fall, but legends like his never die.